just going to do introductions. And then I'll be doing the chat kind of negotiation.
You're going to be alright? See you around there? I think we're going to need to.
We might have to, I think.
Let's do that. I can move around more. I don't have to. Yeah, it was about right. Don't worry.
actually.
Yeah. They got rid of that maroon and put it in blue, and it looks much better.
Ask you a question. Where are you picking me up next Monday? That's a question.
I was like, what?
everybody. Hello, are we ready to make a start? Great. Okay, so welcome to today. It's our first EdSign Lecture, the first lecture in this series this year, 2022-23. So finally we're getting started again. So I'm very excited to welcome our three presenters tonight. EdSign has been set up since 2008. So the three universities based in Edinburgh supported each other to share research and anything linked with deaf studies or sign language. So we've had regular presentations on a monthly basis over the years, and then unfortunately we encountered COVID and everything had to come to a stop. So we've started again now. We've started with this hybrid method that we're using tonight. We have people in the room with us, and I'd let you know that the Deaf Action Bar is full. Plus, we have people watching online. I hope that those of you who are watching on Zoom can see me clearly. We'll welcome your feedback, and I hope that we have no technical problems this evening. Now, can you see the logo for EdSign that we're showing? The G of the word sign is really, it derived from a pile of books, as well as the G hand shape, because it represents study at university and literature. And we have a committee for EdSign, and that connects the four universities to the community, so we can all work together. So I want to welcome tonight to our three presenters. I think if the three of you come up initially. Hi everybody, hello, hello. So we have Professor Jemina Napier. She's a professor of sign language interpreting and translation, and she is going to present tonight. Hello everybody, says Jemina. We've also got Robert Adam with us this evening.
Hello.
And he conducts various research areas that I'm sure he'll be happy to describe later. And we also have Rob Skinner with us.
Hi there.
And Rob has done research on online interpreting in the domain of police work. So they're all based at Heriot-Watt University, so I really want to thank you for coming along this evening to present.
Thank you for asking us.
Thank you, Audrey, thank you. Okay, so we'll make a start. Is there somebody controlling the slides from the back of the room? Can I just check? I can't see anything. I don't see anybody there. Who's managing the slide deck? We need you to stay where you are, Rob, because we need you to present. Okay, thank you. Audrey's taken over responsibility for the slide deck, so everyone in Zoom can see the slides. Here in the room, we've got them presented onto two large screens. So I'll let Audrey know when to change the slides for everyone online. So thank you all for coming along to our first lecture with our, how do we go to sign EdSign now that we have the new logo? EdSign, just EdSign. So, like Audrey said, previously we had multiple lectures every month, regularly, different topics. But now, we're back after COVID has stopped us for a long time, and it's exciting. The three of us are very excited to be presenting together on the topic that you can see on the screen. Linked to our research, the census that we carried out. It was a census of interpreters and translators all over the UK, and we're going to explain more through the course of our talk. Great. Making sure everything's matching in the room and online. So this research project happened, it was really happened through COVID. There was a lot of debate prior to that, a lot of discussion over, BLM. Do you remember hashtag BLM? And George Floyd, the black American man who was killed and died through the police intervention. So there was a lot of discussion at that time about representation, and it really impacted on the entire world, and the issues of diversity, and whether there was representation from different minority groups like the LGBTQI A+ community, and we started thinking about that in the context of sign language interpreters and translators, and we wondered if there was sufficient representation in our profession, and there was a lot of debate in these different publications that are displayed on the screen. ASLI, the Association of Sign Language Interpreters, has a regular publication called Newsly, and we could see many articles being published regularly within that magazine on the same sort of topic or related topics. So there was the decision taken within ASLI that we needed more information about what actually was happening within our profession, who were working as interpreters across the UK. Audrey, can you move the slides on? Perfect. So ASLI decided to fund Harriet Watt to set up a research project to really gather information, to enlighten us about who's working here in the profession of sign language interpreting and translation in the UK, a snapshot, if you like, of the profile of the people working across the nation. So ASLI gave the funding to Harriet Watt, but at the university we felt it was important to have diversity within our research team as well. So we decided to contact 2 other universities within the UK, Wolverhampton University and also the University of the West of Scotland. I almost said of West of Sydney because previously I used to live there, but West of Scotland. So the 3 universities worked together and we had a team of academics who contributed their different experiences to our project. Thanks, Audrey. So you can see who was involved. That's our faces on the screen. There was myself, there was Rob Skinner, Robert Adam, the 3 of us that you've already met, and also we had Christopher Stone and also Sandra Pratt, who are both based at the University of Wolverhampton, and also Chijioke Obasi, this is her sign name, from the University of the West of Scotland. Next slide, please. So we wanted to make sure that the group that was carrying out this research came from different backgrounds. So we had a mix of race, of different experiences of growing up, either in signing homes or not, with hearing or deaf family, from queer communities. The whole range of diversity was mixed, and we felt that was very important within the project. Thanks, Audrey. Also, the 3 universities, we were working together, but we wanted to make sure that in terms of if our research was really to have impact, we needed to have partnership with a range of key organisations who represent interpreters, sign language interpreters and translators, important stakeholders. So we invited them together to be our advisory group, and you can see who they were on the screen. We had ASLI, the funder, and we also had representatives from different registration bodies. IOCN, which is the Interpreters of Colour Network here in the UK. DIN, which is the Deaf Interpreters Network. So you can see the range of different organisations we worked with. Throughout the project, we would have regular discussions with them and use their ideas to inform our survey and the research that we were carrying out. So it was an iterative process. We would have ongoing discussions. We would show them our work, ask them for their views, and you know, it was a to and fro process and discussions with the advisory group throughout the whole work of developing the research project and before we disseminated the results. It was a very important part of the process. So really the aim, as I said before, we wanted a snapshot of who was working as interpreters and translators, their backgrounds, their profiles, what kind of work they did, where they chose to work, where they had been trained and how. So we wanted that kind of snapshot of the nation. So it meant that we would have the data to lobby for diversity and change. We had to know what the baseline was first before we started making suggestions about who we wanted to recruit into the profession. We needed to know who was already there. So, you know, thinking about future recruitment, who we want to encourage into the profession, we needed baseline data first. In terms of students, teachers, where we were working, the whole range. So all of that is relevant to our profession. Just quickly, I'm not going to go into this in any depth because I think most of us here, the students who are here tonight, should know because of their deaf studies work. And we all know that here in the 1970s until today, we've seen a lot of change within the profession, evolution. And, you know, originally it was white men with deaf parents at that time who had no professional training. They had been missioners or social workers, and then gradually we saw a change with more women entering the profession. We saw the development of more training. Eventually we had university degrees set up and the NVQ training was developed as well. So we saw that evolution, which meant that, okay, we could think of the different stages in development of the profession over time, and now we're a new phase of the profession's development, and we need to think about what our profession looks like now. And if we want to think that, we have to look back. We can't just carry on the same way. The world has changed, and our profession has to change accordingly. So the reason we decided to pick a census as our research method was because, you know, the government, Scottish Government, and also the UK Government at Westminster have regular censuses every 5 years. Oh, 10 years. Thank you, Robert. 10 years. You're making me feel old. So, yes, every 10 years you receive, on the day, who lives in your house. You have to fill in the data about age, what they do, their educational background, a whole range of different information about the people that live in your household, which meant we had that data. So if we could extrapolate from the census data and thought we could apply that to interpreting and translation, we could make useful comparisons. And also within the field of interpreting to translation, we could find out if it was a true reflection of broader society or whether it was different. So we felt that was a good way of quickly collecting a lot of data that would give us the snapshot that we wanted to get. So that was what we discussed and eventually agreed on would be our research method. So we created a survey. Very quickly, I'm not going to go through this list, but I just wanted to show this slide to let you know that at regular intervals over the past, I'm trying to have a look, 13, I think the first one was 2002. We've had surveys at regular intervals that have sampled information about interpreters, about information about who they are, sometimes quite brief, sometimes linked to gender, sometimes it was just asking, are you male or women, are you white, are you black? It was a race question only, that's it. Do you have deaf parents? That was the only question. So they were very limited in scope. So this census was much broader. We wanted to collect a much broader set of data so that we would get a true snapshot and a much deeper profile of the people that we were asking the questions of. And now I will pass over to Rob.
Okay, thank you. So, as this slide shows, the census had 74 questions in total, but split up into 5 different thematic groups of questions. You can see them on the slide. When we came up with the questionnaire, it did occur to us, well, it was a very difficult task as a matter of fact. Jemina said that we did want to compare actual UK census data with what we were collecting, but it occurred to us that the questions in the census are very limiting and limited, and we wanted to broaden out some of the information on, say, gender identity, being dealt very briefly in the general census, but we wanted to dig a lot deeper into sexual identity as well as gender identity and a number of other demographic details. But to change our census means it's very difficult to directly compare it with that much larger data set. So we had a bit of an issue and a struggle about how we were going to construct the survey. I mean, one strategy was to be very open and provide lots of open boxes. But there's a big, huge risk there that you collect such a wealth of data about individuals and their answers that you can't really compare them as a group. So you do have to, unfortunately, create questions that label people and put them in boxes and do those things. And it's a bit of a shame. That's not really what we wanted to do. That wasn't our goal, but that's a limitation of a survey instrument. And in order to make it comparable with the wider census data, that's what we did. So the first of those 5 thematic groups was we wanted to know who interpreters were, what their demographics were, their backgrounds, their intersections. We were also interested to know more about their linguistic and social upbringing and background. So before this survey, people would always be asked, are your parents deaf? And we wondered how many people came from deaf families, but we also wondered, well, how about interpreters that have perhaps a deaf brother or a sister, or they just have other deaf family members that, or perhaps even married somebody or partnered with a deaf person. So rather than only having deaf parents, we found it useful to expand that definition, that category. So when we think of the academic courses in the NVQ, we see less and less coda interpreters. Anecdotally, that's what we predicted, because that's what we've discussed in the profession. So this census was going to give us real answers as to how many interpreters in the current field have a deaf family member of some sort. But we also wanted to know if people knew other sign languages as well as BSL and other spoken languages. So we wanted the full picture of their linguistic and social repertoire. The third category of the 5 themes of the questions was about their current professional status. So we wanted to know if people were registered with the NRCPD, or SCOSLI here, or whether they were members of SCOSLI, ASLI, VLP, all the different organisations and associations in our field. The fourth area was about their training. So this is where we were interested in noting how people arrived at the interpreting profession through either the academic pathway or the national vocational qualification pathway. And we wanted to know if that was a gendered experience or an experience based on other intersectional similarities, whether it's on ethnicity. So we wanted to dig deep into that kind of information. And the last of these 4 thematic areas was linked to their work patterns. We wanted to know what they were doing regularly, what was going on a day-to-day basis in their interpreting lives. And there was 2 parts to that. Where do you currently go to work? And where would you like to work? Where are you willing to work? So we split that 5th thematic section into 2. Now we wanted to ask many more questions about well-being, because as you can imagine, during Corona it was a very hot topic about people's own mental health and their well-being. But you can see we've already got 74 questions just in these 5 groups, so we decided to try and aim for a 30-minute completion time. The regular census from the government has about 50 questions. Other professional census tend to have about 50 questions, so we were already over that number, and we were keen to reach as many interpreters as possible. Move on to the next slide, please. So how did we let people know and encourage them to take part? Well, as you'd expect, through social media. That was a main message, main method of dissemination. There are also workshops where interpreters came together through the different associations, so the professional networks that were already in existence. So emails started to go out through these organisations. Our research team, obviously at the university, we've got our own personal and professional networks that we used. But one thing that occurred to us was that many interpreters were unfamiliar with who we were, what was going on, and asked us a lot of questions. So we decided that we needed to set up an online evening event which was open to anybody to ask questions about the survey, of the survey, what we were going to do with the data, so that we could clearly establish our aims and objectives and allay any concerns that people had about taking part in the survey. We had interesting discussions in terms of language of the survey, whether it should be fully in English or BSL or a combination of the both. So we wanted a BSL and English to be the 2 languages of the survey, but we decided in terms of the welcome and the introduction to the survey to have that in BSL and English, and then to offer, if somebody queried and asked and contacted us, to provide the survey through a BSL interview that would be done online. The online survey was in English, and we offered the possibility of doing it in BSL if requested. And here's how many people responded. So from February the 1st to Valentine's Day, I think it was, Sunday the 14th, that was the end date. So for that 2-week period, that was when the survey was open, and we got 690 people who completed the completed all responses. We had more people give up, unfortunately, halfway through. So we got a slight reduction in the 800 or so responses, down to 690 completed. Now, when you advertise statistical data, you have to be incredibly careful about how you group and categorize. A certain researcher may well be a female, black, lesbian, working in a rural area, and you think, well, how do we represent this person, but also not skew results, and how do we distinguish between the different characteristics of all the different interpreters? We then looked at the mean, median, and the mode. So we used that as our survey analysis. Some of our analysis of statistics looked at where there were significant differences or significance. So we wanted to know things like, where do men work as opposed to women interpreters? Is there a difference there? Is there a different experience if you're an ethnic background interpreter? If you're from the LGBTQI plus community or queer community, we wanted to ensure that the survey and the statistics really tackled some of those key demographic issues. And I think at that point, I'm passing on to Robert. Okay, I'm now charged with giving you the results of the survey. But before we go on, and please don't change the slide, what do you think the average interpreter in the UK is like? What's the profile of the average interpreter? Is it a giraffe? No, it's not a giraffe, is it? Hands, anybody? Anybody think who might be an average interpreter? Female? White? How old do we think? 30 to 50? Somewhere between there. Sexuality? Anybody? Straight? If we're talking about your average interpreter, well, let's see how close you were. Wow. Okay. So, the average mean age of interpreters is 44 years old. Correct. Female. Correct. White. Correct. I forgot to ask about deaf and hearing. So, it's a hearing, straight, white, British woman of no religion who has caring responsibilities and is self-employed, and from England. So that is your average BSL interpreter in the UK. It's not a giraffe, okay? So, your average interpreter tends to work much more in interpreting than in translating. They go to a number of different workplaces and genres. Well, workplace 33% as a genre, I should say. Medical comprising 20%, in educational settings 11% of interpreting assignments undertaken. Interpreters did, as we expected, either qualify through the academic route or vocational training system, or a combination of the two. And it's 38. It was 38.8 for vocational, and about 40% for them both. 90% were registered with NRCPD, and 2/3 were a member of ASLI. Interesting, right? So that's your average interpreter. Okay, next slide. But we can see now the range of characteristics. So we have 18-year-old interpreters right up to 76-year-old interpreters. Only 60% of interpreters are male. 0.72% are non-binary, genderqueer or transgender. 2.3% are Black Caribbean. 2% are Black Caribbean, Black African or Caribbean. 1.4% Southeast Asian. 14.49% identify as LGBTQIA+, and 3.9% are deaf or hard of hearing. So that's the characteristic profile of the whole of the profession. Okay, next slide, please. Now we can see some broken down Scottish data. So we have 83% females, 15% male, and 2% non-binary or genderqueer. And that gives us a grand total of 82 interpreters who answered the survey in Scotland. The ethnic background of them was, as you can see from the slide, 2 were East Asian, 1 preferred not to say, 78, which is 95% of them were white, and we had 1 white East Asian, giving us again a total of 82. Interesting stuff, right? Moving on, please. So where are most of the interpreters based? So we did a postcode analysis of where they lived. So we've got, as you can see, Birmingham, Bristol, and Edinburgh as the most populated postcode area. So that doesn't mean that that's where they have as many interpreters, and interpreters do live in outlying areas, but those were the 3 city postcodes. And also, interestingly, the 3 universities, right? Because you think of Wolverhampton University, it's really near Birmingham. Bristol University did used to train sign language interpreters for many, many years, and here we are in Edinburgh. Fascinating, though, that because of the training that we do at Heriot Watt and at Queen Margaret, that Edinburgh, and Rob's feeding me, so thanks very much. London also has a huge population, but because they're broken up into different boroughs, they're not counted as one single group. So in terms of ties or sign language connections with deaf people, a third of interpreters have some sort of family or personal tie to the deaf community, 30%. And almost a quarter, just 22%, know 1 or more sign languages rather than just 1 sign language. Next slide, please. In terms of employment status, we can see that part-time self-employed interpreters comprise 38% of the profession, and females were significantly likely to work part-time than males, as you can see from the slide. Okay, next, please. However, this is a very interesting area of when we look at high-profile, high-status work, television, the theatre, conference, when you're typically looking at somebody on a platform, male interpreters are overrepresented. They score significantly higher in accepting work in that area. And also they were found to score significantly higher on their willingness to engage in working in high status work. Whether they would take it or not, had the confidence to take it or not, more women refused that work and men were much, much more willing and eager to step in. So it's an interesting comparison, isn't it, when you look through the statistics in that way. And when we then go back to what we're seeing in terms of the average interpreter, it's not what we're seeing on the conference platform or on television. That in itself is an interesting finding. Now, work patterns, as Jemina said, and Rob said, obviously there's a huge impact from COVID, and it was evident in that 65% of interpreters were willing to work remotely. And almost 90% have access to some sort of private studio space with either a green screen or a blue background or something, some corner of their house where they can work. And that's typically access to work, small meetings, training events in medical. Those are the areas that comprise most of the interpreters, most of their work. Interpreters are least likely to accept or be willing to work in political, musical, in vision, and police settings. Those are the 4 areas where they are less willing to accept work. Okay? Next. So when we look at the deaf sign language interpreters and translators, we see a slightly different demographic. There's more balanced gender representation than our hearing counterparts. 28% of us are based in London. They're likely to have a deaf family connection and a deaf partner. 1/3 of that group know another sign language, but that group is underrepresented in the BME diversity in terms of general society. Okay, I think we're ready for the next one. And I'll hand back over to Jemina.
So we've thrown a lot of facts and figures at you and statistics this evening, But really it's quite more interesting when you look at the data, but then you try to extrapolate from that and think about what it means. What's the narrative that associates with it? So what can we learn from those statistics? I've got new glasses on and it's making it quite difficult to see. Right, okay, the slide has changed. So in relation to gender, as we said, we knew this, we expected this from the results. We knew that more would be women than men. But when we looked at gender and also sexuality, we could see that compared to previous surveys that had been carried out in the past, there were more people who identified as being part of the queer community as either trans or non-binary, LGBTQIA+. So that might be because previously that question hadn't been asked, that's a possibility, or that now, previously that question, you know, if you asked, are you straight or other? And there were no options provided, which meant that, you know, the norm was assumed to be straight. But we gave people a range of different options to select from. So maybe they felt more connected with it and more willing to answer. Or maybe it's just a facet of the reporting, or maybe it is that generally that community is growing. We don't know the answer to that. So if you compare to the general population, actually the people who were willing to identify and say I'm part of the queer community, really it was a higher percentage in the sign language interpreting and translation profession compared to the statistics in the census. So that's a positive story around diversity. Next, there's a little bit of a surprise over the high status work, that we see more men who are strongly represented in that domain. When we look at the general research around workplaces in general, this research shows that often, you know, that maybe if you work in a company, for example, you have an opportunity for a new job or to be promoted, usually we'll see that men will have a look at the job description and say, oh yes, I can, or I can't do that, can't do that, but never mind, I'll give it a go anyway and apply. Women will usually wait until they've gone through all the characteristics, and then they will say, oh, I can't do that. I'll maybe just wait and not apply until I can meet all the requirements. So this is something that's really gendered within us as children, as part of society. So that is really represented in the general population. So we needed to think about how we can encourage more men to work as interpreters, but at the same time, we want to, yes, grow the number of interpreters working, but we want to make sure we have more women working in high profile, high status jobs as well. So we see the majority of interpreters are women, but they are tending to work within the community, whereas the smaller group of male qualified interpreters, once qualified, tend to escalate to a much higher status level of work. Maybe because they're more willing to accept that kind of work, and women are more careful. So it's interesting to think about how we can change that attitude, how we can encourage both more men into the profession, but also more female interpreters to work at high status jobs, maybe with mentoring or specialised schemes to encourage them. Next slide, please. And another really interesting thing was to compare our results with previous surveys to see that we are seeing a growing number of interpreters and translators from different ethnic backgrounds. We're seeing more diversity. But it is interesting, if we look at the general census of the population, here in the UK, obviously the majority group is white, and the second largest ethnic group is Asian. And then the third group is Caribbean, African, black communities. But it's interesting, within the sign language interpreting and translation census, we found the same finding, that the biggest group were white people, but groups 2 and 3 were the other way around. So actually the second biggest group were black, African or Caribbean interpreters, and then the smallest group were Asian. So that gave us food for thought. So yes, we're seeing more diversity, But we have to think about that in terms of representation of the community. We need to try and encourage more black interpreters, but really we need to encourage more Asian interpreters from the community to become interpreters who can represent their community, represent other members of the deaf community within the family setting, aware of cultural values, studying, and perhaps in Asian culture, we need to think about their traditions of, expectations about earning in a profession and family support. So perhaps that has influenced this situation. It's a little bit different when we're looking at the different cultural groups. And again, mentoring to try and encourage more people into the profession, especially like when we, for example, are using course promotional materials, videos, anything linked to trying to recruit. We need to show a diversity of faces of people so that people can see people that look the same as them in the materials to attract them to think, oh, I can be an interpreter as well. If they only see white women in the promotional materials, that's going to put them off. It's not attractive to people to think about that as a future career for themselves. And another interesting finding, in terms of the general population, same within the interpreting results, there is a very, very small number of people with religious belief. There are pockets of different religious beliefs represented, but the vast majority have no religious belief. So there is a risk of impact on the deaf community who have different faiths and beliefs, whether that be Muslim or Buddhist or Christian. But if interpreters don't want to work in that religious domain because they feel, oh, I'm not a good fit because I don't believe myself, then it means that the deaf community are encountering barriers when they want to practice their faith. And then again, comparing to previous surveys, we are seeing a growth of deaf people who are working as qualified translators and interpreters. That number is growing, and it's good to see that. And we want to welcome more. But it's an interesting balance. It's almost 50-50% of men and women. So we're seeing a gender balance there. It's more or less equal. But there is strong white representation within this group. There is very few people within this group of deaf interpreters and translators from diverse ethnic backgrounds. But one of the biggest problems that we're seeing is that many deaf people who qualify and work as interpreters and translators, most are based in the south, in London. That's the dominant geographical area. I mean, here in Scotland, I think we only have 2. Am I right, Robert? It's you and Claire, yes. So we have maybe some who are working as translators and interpreters, but qualified and registered, we only have 2 in Scotland, only 2. So that's something we need to think about, how we can have a greater dispersion of these professionals across the country so that there is coverage across the UK, not just localised in London. One of the key things that we've seen as well is the limited training opportunities for deaf people who want to become qualified interpreters and translators. Because the university courses, yes, okay, you come for 4 years, you achieve your certificate, but after that, is there enough work for these professionals to work full time? We have to think about that situation at the moment. So yes, we can encourage them to come in, but when they finish university, there may not be the same range of work opportunities available for them. So we have to think about how future work opportunities and training can work together to make sure that we create a pathway for encouraging more deaf interpreters and translators into the profession. And the last one I want to talk about is, again, it's interesting to compare with previous surveys. We're seeing a growth in people who declare themselves to have disabilities in the profession. And again, it's possible because we've asked that question and previous surveys didn't really. There was the assumption that all interpreters are hearing and can walk and can sign. But now there's more awareness of society in general, and that disability isn't only a physical condition, but we have people with neurodiverse conditions as well. So we have a much broader view of that. And so we're looking at now seeing people who are declaring as having disabilities who are neurodiverse, and broader society is more aware of that. So we asked that question, and more people were willing to answer it. Not all, but we have more awareness. And it's good to see that diversity in our professional group. And then moving on. Again, it's interesting. When we call this group heritage signers. That's people who have grown up with deaf parents or maybe deaf family members. So they have grown up not only as CODAs, but maybe they've got deaf grandparents or brothers and sisters within their family. So sign language is within their family. And we're seeing that number grow to 30% compared to previous surveys that showed about 13% as the statistic. And it may be because we asked again the question a little bit differently. Previous surveys have said, have you got deaf parents? And got the answer yes for 13% of respondents. But our question was more detailed, asking if you have deaf family members such as brother, sister, and so on. So maybe that's why we've got a higher number of responses. So when, do you remember if I showed you that slide previously for the dates, the timeline from the 70s till present? You know, we were talking about people who had deaf families, initially being where the pool of interpreters came from. And then with the advent of more training, we saw that number decrease to be more hearing people who wanted to learn to sign and become interpreters. We saw a surge in those numbers, which is good because there wasn't an over-reliance on people who grew up signing. We saw this increase in non-heritage signers. And because, of course, there may be some heritage signers who feel that they're not suited to go into a university course to teach them how to sign from scratch because they already know how to sign. But we need to think about how to encourage them into the profession as well and into academic routes so that for the future we have a good balance. So those who have deaf family and those who are hearing and those who have grown up with sign language using families, plus those who have not had that experience can work and train to become sign language interpreters and translators. One more. Well, I keep saying one more, but so the survey showed that here in the UK, there is the university academic pathway. There's also the NVQ pathway that we mentioned before. And some students will go to university, train and then get registered, and then they'll finish off their training on an NVQ qualification. So many people do both, and they also do it the other way around, NVQ first and then the academic pathway. In the UK, there's only 4 universities that offer training at the moment. And I think there's about 7 vocational training programmes available, so 7 compared to 4. But the 4 university programmes, of those, only 2 are actually undergraduate programmes that aim for people to become interpreters on completion. One of them at QMU is offered only to interpreters who are already qualified and registered. It's offered at a higher level. And then another university, UCLan, offers a postgraduate diploma. So as Robert said previously, Bristol University used to offer training but is now closed down. Durham also still has, but so we're seeing less of these options available across the country. So one of the key areas that we've seen is that a lot of the interpreters said, no, I won't work in this area or that area or this area, but I will take this. So I think we need to think about more specialised training to be made available. So at QMU here in Edinburgh, they have modules on mental health, on medical interpreting, on legal interpreting, on educational interpreting, and creative arts, am I right? Arts and culture, and employment. Thank you, I was just checking with Yvonne. So those are specialised trainings that go into each of these areas in more depth. But there aren't other opportunities for people to learn in that way. So one more. I keep checking. As we said before, we've got interpreters and translators spread out throughout the UK, but the greatest concentration is in the southeast, in the London area. There's a strong congregation there. We've got more deaf interpreters and translators in the same area. And now we know that through COVID, online work has become more prevalent. So there has been a change. We're now coming back to face-to-face, but there is still online working going on. We haven't fully gone back to face-to-face interpreting. So I know that there are Scottish interpreters who are based here in Scotland who are online working for people in London and the other way round. So the geography is possibly less important than it was before. There used to be a concern that we needed a disbursement of interpreters across the UK, but now the options with online working offer more choices to deaf people to work with different interpreters from all over the UK. So it will be interesting to see what the impact of that is in the future. Now, I promise you that is my last slide. I think. Yes, over to Rob.
Okay, so at the end of the day, we've got 20 different recommendations that have come out of the SLTI report or census. They're across 5 main categories. Because we're up here in Scotland, you know, I'm going to fingerspell every single recommend. No. Okay, we're going to move on, and I'll breeze through some of the recommendations that we made to all the stakeholder organisations. So the recommendations that were agreed upon through examining the data, working with the advisory group, and working as a research team, really in terms of looking forward in the interpreting profession. Next slide. I am not going to talk through these exhaustively because I think that would bore everybody. So what's important is to explain the categories of these recommendations. So the first category was recommendations 1 to 6 looked at diversity and representation in the SLTI profession. And we've already talked quite at length what we discovered and what we found. So these recommendations, as you would expect, aim at the training of interpreters, whether that be in university or on the NVQ courses. Plus there were recommendations to interpreting associations, such as VLP, ASLI, SCOSLI. So we went out there, into the interpreting community and engaged. So, and we went to schools. This need to go to schools and how to encourage the future of the interpreting profession. So there's a number of recommendations around that to increase diversity and representation. I will add just one interesting note. With the IOCN, the Interpreters of Colour Network, they, I think, have been involved in the wording of every single one of these recommendations because we realised and recognised that this was an important area for the profession to grow. So we can see a through line throughout these recommendations that really hopes to embed those issues within the recommendations. We move on to the next group of recommendations. So these recommendations, were really about the marketing and promotion of the SLTI profession. And looking back, we would see on the ASLI website and others, very white dominated landscape and lacking somewhat in diversity. So the importance was recognised in terms of how we show our profession to the outside world and how we represent our profession through marketing and promotion. And there are a lot of these recommendations, well, these 4 are in that main area. Move on, please. Similarly linked to training and education of interpreters, there's 4 recommendations that came out of the report, as you can see from this slide. Move on. These recommendations are focusing on the practice of sign language interpreters and translations, and there was also 4 of those. We can move on. And the last 2 recommendations looked at the idea of an ongoing review of this collation and collection of data. And the question was raised, should we be doing a census every 10 years, such as the governments do, or every 5 years more regularly? And should the next survey be only in English, or should it be made fully available in BSL? So I think we can move on to the next slide now. So thinking about all of that, what would we do differently next time? One of the really interesting things that came out of this survey in terms of complaints was the postcode question. A lot of people said, well, I live here, but I work over here. And we also saw the postcode, some postcodes areas, in terms of identifying with the adjacent postcode, because that's where they basically spent more of their time. But I think Jemina already explained that if you say as an interpreter, I work in Edinburgh, but you're working online with a deaf person who lives in London, and you're interpreting between them and a hearing person in Northern Ireland, what do you put down? Do you put down their locations or the interpreter's locations? So it's a difficult question to answer. So we then queried the value of that question in COVID and post-COVID times. But what we did decide was we would definitely construct a survey instrument in both fully in English and BSL from the get-go. Can we move on? So now we know an awful lot about interpreters, who they are and their profiles. But then we have to think about the deaf community, how we match or represent those that community. It's very important for us to have an awareness and be able to compare the data about the deaf community more widely with demographics of wider population. And shall I wrap up? I think we're done, aren't we? That's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Oh, sorry, my apologies. I've just been told that we're going to have a little break, after which there will be time for some questions and discussion. This is a 5-minute break for those of you watching online. 5-minute break. She's doing
Hello, hello everybody. Okay, we're back now after the break for questions. So, great job to the three of you. Thank you very much. If you'd like to come on stage to answer the questions from the audience. Thank you very much for sharing the important findings from your research, who actually are the interpreters here in the UK. So, first, I think we're going to ask the Zoom audience. You've given us your questions in the chat box, so we're going to answer your questions first. After your questions are already in the chat, we're going to open the questions up to the room, and then we'll come back to Zoom and check if there are any further questions. Okay. Everybody clear? Great. Everyone ready?
First question is from Benjamin Gorman, asked how many respondents requested the survey in a BSL format?
Okay, which one of us will answer that? I'll answer that. It was 0. But it's interesting, within the team we had discussions about offering that, and we thought if anybody wanted to go through the questions in BSL, then we would certainly offer. If they contacted us, we would offer a one-to-one, but nobody took us up on that offer. And we realised that it was maybe because there was, they felt a bit embarrassed about asking it. It's as if they were letting us know that they were struggling to read the English and that they would prefer it in BSL. So it was a bit of a muddy area. So we had the questions, next time I think we would put the questions in English and BSL. That was a learning point for us for the next time. Would you agree? Next question, please.
Next question from Alison Hendry. She's asking, why was the survey only open for 2 weeks? Was there a reason for the 2-week time frame?
Me again, okay. It's because, you know, the government survey, usually it's only for 1 day for their census. So I think originally we discussed, you know, 1 day, that's not going to be suitable. Interpreters are busy going off working. We thought maybe 1 week, and then we decided to extend that to 2 because we wanted to get as many possible respondents as we could. So we felt 2 weeks would give us a nice snapshot. If we'd extended the time period for responses for too long, it wouldn't have quite met the requirements of our funders. We only had funding for the project for 6 months, so we had to move at quite a rapid pace. And just to add to what you've said, Jemina, I think that within that 6-month period, you know, I think we did the best we could to collect the data that we did.
We have a question now from Rob Geeney, asking, was there a statistic for people who were willing to work in person? For example, were there any interpreters who said they would only work remotely?
The survey went out in February 2021, am I right? Yes, February 2021. So that was 1 year after the first lockdown. So we weren't yet back to face-to-face working. I think it's a good question, and definitely we would put it in our next survey. But at the same time, you know, deaf people reported that it was difficult to find interpreters because many interpreters only wanted to work online. It was difficult to find interpreters to work with deaf people face to face.
Next question from Benjamin Gorman. When you were talking about the male interpreters being more willing to take on jobs than female interpreters, does that mean that male SLTIs are taking on jobs that they're not suited or capable of?
Let's pass over to the male interpreter in the room. And Robert saying, well, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure I've got the right background to answer that question. Joanna thinks it's a good question. I think it's a loaded question, shall we say. But also, it's not our role to judge the skills, the appropriate skills of the interpreters out there. We simply wanted a snapshot of what job they were doing or not. That's a different project to investigate whether people have the appropriate skills or not. And, you know, the question was, would we accept the job? Would they accept the job or not? Would you be ready to accept, willing to accept it? Yeah. And I think you can reach your own conclusion with that point.
We have just a bit laggy, that's all.
Slight time with the technology.
Alison's statement, did you find anything about average retirement age?
We did have some responses from retired interpreters, 3, 4, 5, I think maximum. I think maybe when interpreters you know, but it would be nice to know more about that. And also doing free pick their own hours so they can continue working, perhaps older, but just reducing their working hours. That's an option for them. Maybe looking at the older age demographic, we might find more part-time workers in that group compared to the younger interpreters. I don't know. Jemina is going on to say that, linked to that point, we didn't specifically ask that question. You know, did you work, or when did you retire, or when you plan to retire? So we were asking interpreters who were working at the time, and we asked of them their age. So when people responded to our survey, we assumed they were still working. So we didn't specifically ask about retirement information, but certainly we could include that question the next time. When do you plan to retire? Soon? 60, 70, 75, 80? I think there's one interpreter still working in Australia who's 80, late 80s, still working away. But very, very, very part-time, yeah, and one-to-one, as Robert is saying, only in one-to-one settings.
So the next online question is from Benjamin Gorman again, related to whether people work full-time or not. How many deaf respondents said that they worked full-time as an RSLT, so a translator?
Again, within the translation group, we saw a very small number. It wasn't a big group. And we didn't ask if they were working full-time or part-time. We didn't go into any depth in analysing that. I'm trying to remember, I think maybe 1 or 2, Jemina's saying. I think we found 1, Robert said, that was interesting. But, you know, when it's a small group, as Robert's adding, how do you maintain confidentiality around that one person? It's a bit tricky. And also, Robert's saying, not linked with the data, but in terms of the topic, we have to think, is there enough work out there for deaf interpreters and translators to allow them to work full-time? So it is an interesting question. Thank you for your interesting questions. We're now going to open up the floor here in the room. So if anyone has a question, you can come up onto the platform and sign it for the audience on Zoom, or Andy will come up and if you prefer to speak. So any questions from anybody here?
Okay, I hope everyone can see okay. Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. I'm just wondering, it would be really interesting to see data relating to the working lives of interpreters in terms of pre-qualification, qualification. You know, what's their average lifespan? What's their journey like across their career, if you like? What's the life expectancy of an interpreter before we have to put them out to pasture? So, you know, how many interpreters do we need to keep training every year? It'd be really good to know that sort of statistical information.
Yes, I mean, it would be good to know that, but we didn't specifically ask that question. It is definitely an interesting point. You know, anecdotal observation suggests that, you know, previously, for example, teachers of the deaf and missioners were interpreting, and then we saw the rise in professionalisation and you know, everything we've talked about. So we're now dealing with a new professional domain. So it's interesting to see how many of the interpreters from start till end, to the bitter end, what is their journey? Do they go on to other careers, or have they had other careers prior to becoming an interpreter?
We did ask, actually, have you worked before in another career before transitioning to interpreting? Didn't we? I think we put that, I'm pretty sure that question was in. So we've got that knowledge of how many interpreters had some sort of previous occupation or career, and interpreting is their second job, their second career.
And maybe just to add to that point, I mean, today we have presented you a snapshot of our snapshot, the key findings that we came up with, but we do have much more in-depth information if you're interested in more of the data. You know, we have a very thick data set, rich data set, so we tried to provide a summary. We've got a summary in BSL, but on the ASLI website, you can freely download the full report if you want, that goes into the issues in more depth. So, and as Rob said before, you know, a lot of questions, you know, we created a big list of questions around well-being, about how interpreting affects mental health, or how did it make you feel working in that situation, and so forth. And we had to drop a lot of those. We had to take them off and really just focus ourselves on the snapshot of who is out there working as an interpreter, what's their profile, where do they work, where have they been trained, you know, the key issues. But I think, as Max raised his point, I think, you know, it would be have a great deal of impact on planning of recruitment and training of interpreters. And like Alison said before, how many expect to retire and when? You know, in order to keep that pipeline going, how many do we need to bring into the profession on a regular basis? So those are both very interesting questions.
And although when we think about health and safety and ergonomics and how many days and hours interpreters could and should be working safely, this is important information for us to garner as well. I always remember one question that I was asked linked to this piece of work was, okay, so we've got some really good data about who interpreters are, but we need to know who the deaf people are. What are their interpreting needs? What's the needs analysis? You know, where do we need to fill the gaps? Where's the demand for interpreters across the lifespans of deaf people? So we've got the information on one side of the equation. We really need to look at the other side of the equation to ensure that we're matching demand with supply.
I was wondering if different groups of interpreters, looking at their age, their racial background, their ethnicity, how that matched with the deaf people in terms of the demographics of both of these
Well, that's
populations.
exactly what we don't know. This is the problem. Like Rob said right at the end just there, it would be great. We can only compare interpreters with the general population from the government census information that we have. So we can look at the society's profile that way, but we haven't interrogated the deaf community. We can talk about our gut instinct and what we feel, but we don't have any evidence. We asked about
Census.
in the census asks about BSL, so you could look at that number of people and try and draw from those statistics. But that superficial analysis is all you get at this stage.
Questions about the high status jobs. The high status jobs. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to support women, you know, for example, to achieve this high status work? Everyone's looking at me. I think it's the responsibility of everyone. You know, if men are offered work and they accept it, they have the possibility of bringing in a female co-worker, for example. So, for example, the three of us work in the BBC regularly, signing on the news, different programmes, and for a while, I think before Robert joined the team, I was the only one woman working in the news team. Everyone else was male. And both Rob and I were constantly campaigning to say we need more women, we need more diversity. And at the time, everyone was white as well. But now, fortunately, we have more deaf people in. We've got Robert. We're growing the number of women who are working in the team. We're looking at a more diverse team in general. So I think all interpreters have to accept responsibility for that. So if, you're offered a job, for example, like you're offered a job, perhaps you could recommend a co-worker. If you only provide names of potential co-workers who are other white male interpreters, that's not going to solve this problem. So I think other options are that professional associations like ASLI need to establish mentoring programs to encourage women to see that there are pathways, or people from diverse backgrounds to see that there are pathways. One example from before, we have international signed interpreters accreditation in the world, and it's the same. A huge percentage of that group are male. Actually, it's about 50-50 now, but if originally we looked, it was about 80-20. So, and it's because a lot of women didn't apply for that accreditation. And one person said, it's up to them, the women, to apply, and if they don't apply, there's not much we can do about it. But we actually have to think about why they don't apply and how we can support them to think about applying. The system as well. Each of us has individual responsibility within that.
I think it's an interesting question. When you look at the WFD WASLI International Interpreter Accreditation list, you talk about it being 50-50 balanced on gender, but is it 50-50 balanced in terms of who's working, who's getting the regular work? Robert's saying who's visible, who's seen to be doing that work. Back to Rob. I agree with Jemina that this is a real problem that we have, but the best thing to do is acknowledge the problem and be aware of it. And it is our collective responsibility as practitioners and as a profession to ensure that we deploy more female interpreters in those settings.
Oh, we have an online question, I think. 2 more online questions. So we'll get Andy back up onto the platform.
One from Derek Todd is asking, what's next for the project? And using the data that you do have, what can be done to attract the future generations of BSL English interpreters, deaf translators from different genders and diverse cultures, both the university and the private training route for sustainability? It seems that a small number of interpreters are considering a different career away from the interpreting profession, and that's a concern because we're already struggling with the demand of interpreters, especially in face-to-face work. So what's next, and how can we use your data that you already have?
Well, in terms of what's next, we have somebody from the ASLI board here. And it was ASLI who commissioned this research. So we did it, we carried it out for ASLI. So I don't know what's next. If ASLI wants us to give us more funding for ongoing research, we'd be very happy to keep going. But it was a very small amount of funding. And the team really volunteered quite a lot of our time, offered a lot of our time free to complete this work. There's a lot of work involved, so we need to think perhaps a bit more deeply about how we're going to organise that if we're to do it again in the future. And also within one of the recommendations that Rob was talking about earlier, you could see that we had a long list of recommendations, but there was one linked to marketing and how university courses promote their courses. Rob talked about the need to go out to schools, outreach work to encourage diverse potential students into the profession. And that's one of the things that we recommended, that we should set up a group for everybody involved in interpreter training, university providers, NVQ providers, to come together and to really discuss how we can take responsibility to recruit a more diverse population. So, for example, at Wolverhampton University, they have a more diverse student population, and that is particularly linked to where they're situated in the Midlands, because that is quite a diverse area. I mean, in Edinburgh, I'm afraid, we have a less diverse population generally, which is true of most of Scotland, and we can see the impact on, you know, that who's coming to be trained. So we thought that if training providers could get together and discuss this issue, it might be something that we could work on together. Thank you for your question. You talked about how many interpreters were happy to work remotely, but a smaller number perhaps wanted to go back to face-to-face working. But how is that going to impact on the deaf community? How is that going to affect the deaf community looking to the future? So, for example, if my daughter wants to study to be a good interpreter at university and will maybe apply next year, but face-to-face working is reduced, that's maybe an issue. What are we looking at in the future? Is it going to be all remote interpreting? But how is that going to affect the community?
I just want to clarify, Joe. So, you know, interpreters didn't say, I prefer remote over face-to-face. That's not what they were saying. We asked them, do you do remote interpreting privately in your own home? Have you got a private setup? And what was it? It was a massive number, wasn't it? 90% said that they did. They had some sort of setup at home.
And it was through COVID after
Right,
all.
and I think that's important. So I think we need to bear in mind that at the time we were all locked down. So interpreters looking for work couldn't do face-to-face work. So they made sure they had the right equipment, and so we were asking them how far along that journey they'd gone. That's what we wanted to know. Robert's saying, and at the same time, you know, again, we knew anecdotally it's very difficult to, for people to get interpreters because they were working so much remotely. There is other research on this subject. The one that
There's one other piece of research that was carried out by a team of 3, one based in France, two in Belgium. And they sent out a survey. It was a global survey, actually. It went out across the world to ask questions around how COVID had impacted on interpreters' work. And they published a report on the basis of their findings, and it was focused specifically on interpreters, their work, and how it had changed through being online. But our research was really a snapshot of who was out there and where they worked. So the aim was slightly different. So we can maybe see that there's still some interpreters are hanging on to wanting to work remotely, others are happy to that face-to-face.
But I think what was interesting is that, you know, people who are working, it was Sign Video and Sign Live, both those companies, the VRS companies, they've rapidly expanded, so that's probably skewed those results. They're both much bigger than they were before in terms of interpreting entities.
We've got 2 more questions, and then that's it. We'll have to wrap up.
I'm going to have to wait till I'm here.
Did you find that there was a link between the interpreter's age or their stage of their career and what jobs they were willing to undertake? So if they were very younger, either in age or in stage of career, were they willing to do more or less diverse work? Maybe the older they got or the longer they'd been interpreting, they maybe decided that they didn't want to do court interpreting anymore or medical interpreting, they maybe got fed up or jaded with it.
That's a good question. I can't answer it. because we didn't do that. But it is a good point. Our analysis focused on the overlap between gender, part-time, full-time work, sexual preference, race, background. So we did some cross-analysis about impact, but actually that's a very good point. That's a good question. We didn't analyse age related to areas of work. We maybe could go back and extract that from the data, but we haven't actually done that analysis yet.
Would it maybe affect?
Once again, please.
Would it maybe affect the provision of interpreters for the deaf community if you've only got certain ages of interpreters willing to work in certain areas?
Yes. We found that many of the young interpreters were less willing to take on court work, medical, police work, for example, but that is perhaps a product coming from their training where they have been instructed that they shouldn't leap straight into these more specialised high-risk areas.
Okay, it's me again. So this question, you know, I mean, I appreciate you had, what, 76 or so questions, so you had to be, you know, careful about how many questions that you ended up asking, but I was wondering about any questions about skills, extra skills, such as working with deaf-blind clients, specific proficiencies. Did they talk about areas that they were skilled in, or did you interrogate them about working into English, more working into sign, those sorts of things about their skills and the skills development? And how useful that you think data like that might be? Because it's only really based on their own views of their own skills.
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by skilled. Do you mean highly skilled, or do you mean skilled enough for the community in general, or not skilled enough? It's objective, yes, but it's also very subjective, so it's quite a tricky question. The problem is, I mean, you're right, it would be interesting, but that's again another research project, because this project, as I said, was a snapshot for who is out there working. We wanted to collect data from trainee and qualified RSLI and trainee, and also students who are going through their training programme. So those were the three groups that were involved in the survey. And we have to assume that if you're a registered trainee or a fully qualified registered interpreter, you know, that will give us the numbers within each of these groups. But we know, as Robert said, to ask you to evaluate your own skill level. Like if I asked you, for example, right now, to evaluate yourself, perhaps my evaluation of your skills would be different from your own. So yes, it would be interesting, but it would have overcomplicated our census.
Yeah, you got a Likert scale of 1 to 5. Yeah, I'm skilled 5 in this area, or 3. You know, I mean, everyone would go for the middle, wouldn't they? Plus, I mean, if you take, I'm an RSLI, then we know you've got some level of proficiency that adheres to a national standard.
Yes, minimum level 6 would be the requirement to be a registered SLI.
But again, it's one of those really great questions, but
we did have a question about deaf-blind interpreters within part of the survey. I think it was associated with the different categories of work, the different domains, mental health, medical, legal, and so forth, whether there was hands-on interpreting.
there was also the ability to say I'm a registered lip speaker, I'm a registered deaf-blind interpreter. Those options were available within the survey as well.
Yeah, so it's just a small part of the research.
Thank you.
So I really want to thank the three of you so much. Thank you very much. It's very important to share the findings from your research, and thank you everybody online for watching us. Thank you for your questions. I would just want to let you know about our next lecture. It's going to be on the 20th of December, and it's going to be about deaf education and the BSL Act. We have two presenters. Their photos are on the Zoom screen. So we've got Rob Wilkes, who will be presenting with Rachel O'Neill. So that's going to be the 20th of December. So you are welcome to come here, and we will send the announcement out so that you can register for the event if you would like to attend. And Jemina has just reminded me, on the 20th of January, we have a Burns Supper event, so I'll let you know more information through Twitter and Facebook about that. So please come, you're very welcome to come and eat haggis and enjoy a ceilidh with us. Where's it going to be? It's going to be at the Gilly Doo. The Gilly Doo, which is a venue here in Edinburgh, and it's going to be via Deaf Action. So thanks again everyone for attending, and bye-bye. Bye. Bye everyone.
Yeah,